In the winter of 1904, the most powerful bankers in America leaned forward in their leather chairs and whispered a name with equal parts greed and disbelief. She claimed to control a fortune so vast it could rival the industrial titans of her age. A secret inheritance, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the only proof she offered was her word. Her name was Cassie Chadwick. At a time when America worshipped steel barons and railroad kings, when men like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller towered over the economy like living monuments, Cassie Chadwick stepped into their world draped in velvet and audacity. She did not build railroads. She did not refine oil. She did not invent anything. She invented wealth. The early 20th century was an era intoxicated by expansion. Banks multiplied across the Midwest. Credit flowed more freely than ever before. Industrialization had transformed small towns into financial arteries, feeding the nation's hunger for growth. Money was no longer just gold locked in vaults. It was trust. It was paper. It was signatures and promises. And Cassie understood something most financiers overlooked. The system did not run on money. It ran on belief. Born Elizabeth Bigley in rural Canada, she had practiced deception since her youth. Petty frauds, forged checks, false identities. Each scheme sharpened her instincts. She learned that authority could be manufactured, that confidence could silence suspicion, that people saw what they wanted to see, especially if what they saw confirmed their ambitions. By the time she arrived in Cleveland under the name Mrs. Cassie Chadwick, she had refined her greatest creation yet. She claimed to be the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. The assertion was outrageous. Carnegie was one of the richest men in the world. His fortune, built on steel, reached into the hundreds of millions. To suggest a hidden heir was to suggest access to one of the largest private fortunes on earth. Yet Cassie did not present this story recklessly. She constructed it carefully, like a cathedral of lies built brick by brick. She visited a lawyer in New York and arranged a private meeting. There she orchestrated a theatrical display, a sealed envelope, a promissory note allegedly signed by Carnegie himself. The amount written on the document was staggering. Millions upon millions, supposedly to be paid to her quietly to avoid scandal. The lawyer never verified the note directly with Carnegie. He did not dare insult a titan by questioning his signature. Instead, he whispered the secret to a banker, and the banker whispered it to another. Soon, the financial circles of Cleveland buzzed with rumors. A hidden heiress, a fortune too delicate to expose publicly, a woman who would someday inherit unimaginable wealth. Cassie never asked banks for small sums. She demanded enormous loans, hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time. She offered little collateral beyond the implication that Andrew Carnegie's silent hand stood behind her. Bankers reasoned that if even a fraction of the story were true, lending to her was safe. When the inheritance surfaced, she would repay everything with interest. The risk seemed negligible. After all, who would dare fabricate such a connection? She dressed the part. Heavy silks, diamonds, a carriage waiting at the curb, servants answering doors. She cultivated the image of untouchable wealth. And in an age when social status defined credibility, appearance became evidence. One bank approved a loan, then another, then another. Each approval validated the last. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. Banks relied on reputation. Reputation relied on whispers. Whispers relied on secrecy. And secrecy shielded the lie from scrutiny. No one wanted to be the banker who offended Andrew Carnegie by investigating too closely. No one wanted to admit they might have been deceived. So they leaned on each other's confidence instead of verifying the foundation beneath it. Cassie borrowed more than $2 million, an astronomical sum in the early 1900s. Adjusted for modern value, it would amount to tens of millions today. Yet, beneath the gowns and carriages, the machinery of her empire was fragile. She paid old debts with new loans. Interest accumulated quietly like a storm gathering over the Great Lakes. Each bank believed itself protected by Carnegie's phantom fortune. But Andrew Carnegie knew nothing about her. And as the loans grew larger, so did the unease. One cautious banker began to calculate the inconsistencies. Another quietly questioned the documentation. A single inquiry, made without fanfare, threatened to unravel the illusion that had sustained her rise. For years, she had manipulated the system's greatest vulnerability, its faith and prestige, now that faith was about to be tested. Because when belief is the only collateral, the collapse, when it comes, is absolute. The first crack did not come from a rival banker or a jealous socialite. It came from arithmetic. Inside the quiet offices of a Cleveland bank, a loan officer reviewed Mrs. Chadwick's obligations and felt something shift. The numbers were growing faster than seemed reasonable even for a secret heiress. Her borrowing had become relentless, each request larger than the last. Each promise anchored to the same invisible inheritance. He asked a simple question. If Andrew Carnegie truly intended to provide for her, why was she borrowing so aggressively? The question lingered. Until then, the system had protected her. Banking at the turn of the century was built on personal relationships, private assurances, and handwritten notes. Credit reports were primitive. Oversight was minimal. There was no centralized authority monitoring exposure, no FDIC to ensure deposits, no SEC to enforce transparency. Trust flowed informally between men who believed they could read character better than they could read balance sheets. Cassie exploited that culture with precision. She never claimed immediate access to Carnegie's fortune. Instead, she implied it was tied up in trust, constrained by discretion. The promissory note she displayed was allegedly for a vast sum, but payable at a future date. She suggested that public acknowledgement would destroy Carnegie's reputation, that scandal would ripple across markets. The bankers were not merely lending to a woman, they were safeguarding a secret, and secrets are expensive. Each time a bank extended her credit, it strengthened the illusion for the next. Her rising debt became proof of legitimacy. After all, would so many institutions lend to a fraud? The logic fed itself. Collective confidence replaced individual verification. This was the hidden financial mechanism behind her ascent. Not forged paper alone, but the psychology of shared risk. By 1904, her debts exceeded $2 million. Some estimates crept even higher. To contextualize the scale, many regional banks at the time operated on total capital not much greater than what she owed individually. A single default could cripple them, yet they continued. Why? Because the alternative was terrifying. If her story were false, it meant senior bankers across Ohio had been deceived. It meant due diligence had failed. It meant reputations built over decades could crumble overnight. So they chose belief over embarrassment. But arithmetic does not respect pride. The cautious banker who questioned her obligations sent a discreet inquiry to New York. He did not accuse. He simply sought confirmation. The response came back cold and unequivocal. Andrew Carnegie had no knowledge of Mrs. Cassie Chadwick. No illegitimate daughter, no promissory note, no secret arrangement. The signature on the document was forged. When word began to circulate, it moved faster than the rumors that once elevated her. This time, whispers carried panic instead of admiration. Banks began demanding repayment. Cassie responded the only way she could, by seeking new loans to satisfy the old ones. But confidence, once fractured, cannot be easily restored. Doors that once opened with deference now hesitated. Clerks who once bowed now stalled. The structure she built was never supported by assets. It was supported by momentum, and momentum was fading. Her creditors started to compare notes. The totals shocked them. Many had believed they were her primary lender. Few realized how entangled they were collectively. The web of exposure stretched across institutions, linking them in shared vulnerability. The danger was no longer theoretical. If she defaulted, banks would collapse, depositors would panic, a regional financial crisis could ignite. Under mounting pressure, one institution moved first: legal action, asset seizure, public accusation. For the first time, her name appeared not in society columns, but in headlines shadowed by suspicion. The spectacle drew crowds. Reporters swarmed her residence. They expected hysteria. Instead, she projected calm indignation. She insisted the matter was a misunderstanding, that powerful interests sought to silence her, that Carnegie's silence was strategic. Even as evidence mounted, some believed her. That was the final haunting testament to the power of narrative over numbers. But behind closed doors, the math was unforgiving. There were no hidden trusts, no ironclad inheritance, only forged notes and compounding interest. And when federal authorities entered the picture, the stakes escalated beyond Cleveland's banking elite. Mail fraud charges loomed. Interstate transactions invited national scrutiny. What had begun as whispered loans now threatened to become a public reckoning. The illusion that had shielded her depended on discretion. Courtrooms do not offer discretion. They offer exposure. As subpoenas were drafted and investigators traced the flow of funds, a deeper realization settled over the financial community. This was not merely the story of one audacious woman. It was a mirror held up to a system that preferred prestige over proof. And soon, that mirror would shatter. The courtroom did not resemble the drawing rooms where Cassie Chadwick once reigned. There were no velvet curtains, no whispered deference, no carriage waiting outside. There were reporters, creditors, and the cold geometry of facts arranged for public dissection. By the time federal charges were filed, the illusion had thinned to a fragile membrane. Mail fraud became the lever prosecutors used to pry open her empire. Every letter sent across state lines, every promissory note circulated through the postal system transformed her deception into a federal offense. The same paper that once elevated her now condemned her. Investigators began tracing the architecture of her scheme. They followed loan agreements from Cleveland to New York. They examined signatures under magnification. Handwriting experts compared the flowing script on Carnegie's alleged notes with authentic samples. The differences were unmistakable. There was no secret trust, no silent benefactor, only ink and nerve. Yet, even as evidence mounted, a strange resistance persisted among some of her lenders. Several bankers hesitated to testify fully. To admit the truth was to confess their own negligence. They had not demanded verification. They had not confronted Carnegie directly. They had relied on each other's assumptions, constructing a tower of credit on a foundation of rumor. The scandal threatened more than their balance sheets. It threatened their credibility. Behind closed doors, directors convened emergency meetings. They assessed exposure, calculated losses, and braced for depositor panic. In an era without deposit insurance, fear could move faster than any telegraph. A single rumor of insolvency could trigger a run, draining vaults within hours. Cassie's arrest became public spectacle. When authorities entered her mansion to seize assets, the image of opulence dissolved under scrutiny. Jewelry proved to be modest in value. Furnishings were impressive, but insufficient to cover even a fraction of her debts. The grand residence itself was heavily leveraged. The wealth had always been theatrical. The real money had passed through her hands like water, borrowed from one bank, redirected to another, spent to maintain the illusion of prosperity. Carriages, gowns, social gatherings, each expense served a purpose. They reinforced the narrative that she belonged among the elite, and narrative was her most valuable asset. As the trial unfolded in 1905, the prosecution painted a portrait of calculated manipulation. They described how she had cultivated intermediaries, how she orchestrated the visit to the New York lawyer, how she allowed gossip to do the heavy lifting. She rarely made explicit claims in writing. Instead, she implied, suggested, allowed others to infer. It was a masterclass in plausible deniability, but implication does not erase responsibility. Witnesses testified to loans totaling millions. Some bankers appeared defiant, insisting they had believed in her legitimacy. Others seemed subdued, as though confronting a personal humiliation. Andrew Carnegie himself never appeared dramatically in court. His denial had already shattered the foundation of her story. The Titan of steel remained distant, his silence now definitive rather than protective. In her defense, Cassie maintained composure. She denied deliberate fraud. She hinted at misunderstandings. She implied that powerful men had once acknowledged her privately. Even in collapse, she clung to ambiguity. Yet the numbers were undeniable. The cumulative debts exceeded $2 million. Several banks teetered dangerously close to failure. Smaller institutions faced severe losses that would echo through their communities. Depositors, many of them ordinary workers, risked seeing their savings evaporate because bankers had chased prestige. The jury deliberated. Outside, crowds gathered not merely to witness a trial, but to observe the unraveling of a myth. America had long romanticized self-made fortunes. Cassie offered a darker counterpart, a fortune self-made from fiction. When the verdict came, it was swift, guilty. The sentence was severe, years in federal prison, fines, confiscation. But punishment did not immediately repair the damage. Several banks collapsed in the aftermath. Confidence eroded. The scandal contributed to broader anxieties that would later culminate in the Panic of 1907, when systemic weaknesses in American banking became painfully visible. Cassie had not caused that crisis alone, but her scheme illuminated the vulnerabilities simmering beneath the surface. Trust without verification, credit without transparency, prestige without proof. As she was led away to serve her sentence, the spectacle ended. No more gowns, no more whispered secrets, only iron bars and the echo of a question that haunted every banker who had signed her checks. How could so many powerful men have believed so completely? Because she had understood something fundamental about finance. Money is not merely currency, it is confidence. And once confidence fractures, the collapse is not gradual, it is sudden. Yet even as she entered prison, the full consequences of her deception were still unfolding beyond those walls. Laws would change, oversight would evolve, but for now the system remained exposed and fragile. The breaking point was near. Cassie Chadwick entered the Ohio penitentiary stripped of silk and spectacle, reduced to a number in a ledger she could no longer manipulate. The woman who once convinced bankers she controlled a hidden empire of steel now occupied a narrow cell with iron bars and stone walls that offered no audience for performance. Her health deteriorated quickly. Years of excess, stress, and the psychological weight of exposure began to consume her. In 1907, just 2 years after her conviction, she died in prison. She was 49 years old. But her death did not close the ledger. The financial wreckage she left behind rippled outward through Cleveland and beyond. Several banks collapsed under the strain of unrecoverable loans. Smaller institutions, heavily exposed to her debts, were forced into liquidation. Depositors, shopkeepers, factory workers, families who had entrusted their savings to local banks, absorbed losses that could not be undone. The elite bankers who had courted her suffered humiliation more painful than financial damage. Reputations built over decades dissolved in months. Directors resigned. Lawsuits multiplied. Confidence in regional banking eroded. And at a national level, her scheme became part of a growing awareness that the American financial system operated on dangerously informal foundations. There was no central bank to stabilize liquidity, no unified regulatory body scrutinizing large exposures. Credit decisions were often based on relationships and whispered endorsements rather than verified documentation. Cassie had not created these weaknesses. She had illuminated them. Her fraud demonstrated how easily prestige could override prudence. In the years that followed, financial reform would slowly gather momentum. The Panic of 1907 would expose systemic fragility on a much larger scale, ultimately leading to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Oversight mechanisms strengthened, banking practices evolved, verification became more rigorous. Yet the underlying vulnerability she exploited never disappeared, because finance remains a system built on belief. Cassie Chadwick did not possess factories or railroads. She possessed narrative control. She understood that in an environment driven by ambition and secrecy, the suggestion of proximity to immense wealth could unlock doors faster than any audited statement. She recognized the psychology of greed. Bankers were not blinded by her charm alone. They were seduced by opportunity. The chance to attach their institution to Carnegie's hidden fortune promised profit and prestige. Each loan was rationalized as temporary, safe, inevitable to be repaid, and so the lie scaled upward. In modern markets, the instruments have changed. Today we speak of derivatives, leverage ratios, and algorithmic trading. Institutions answer to regulators. Acronyms like SEC and FDIC stand as guardians of transparency. Balance sheets are scrutinized by analysts across the globe in real time. Yet bubbles still form. Fraud still thrives where verification yields to excitement. The lesson of Cassie Chadwick is not confined to a single woman in a velvet gown. It is a warning about collective delusion. When institutions rely on each other's assumptions instead of primary evidence, risk multiplies invisibly. When reputation substitutes for proof, exposure compounds silently. She forged a signature, but the banks forged their own blindness. In the end, she did not outsmart the financial system because she was uniquely brilliant. She succeeded because the system wanted her story to be true. That desire proved more powerful than skepticism. Her life remains a study in how easily wealth can be simulated and how devastating the consequences become when confidence collapses. Behind every modern financial scandal lies the same fragile element she manipulated more than a century ago. Trust, invisible, essential, dangerous. And when trust is extended without discipline, the cost is never paid by the illusionist alone. It is absorbed by communities, by workers, by institutions that discover too late that belief is not collateral. Cassie Chadwick's mansion is gone. The carriages have vanished. The forged notes have yellowed into historical artifacts. But the mechanism endures because money still moves on faith. And faith, without scrutiny, is the most volatile asset of all. To understand the future of money, we must first understand its past. Subscribe to uncover the truth.